In the wonderful world of Oz, style is everything. Whether they're adorned in golds, pinks, blues, blacks, or of course green, how Ozians choose to dress themselves tells us a lot about who they are. From The Wizard of Oz to The Wiz to Wicked, the style identity of these stories has existed in the pop culture lexicon for decades, becoming just as iconic as the pieces of media that they come from. These wardrobe decisions are intrinsically tied to the characters who are dressed in them. Like who would Glinda be without her signature pink, or Dorothy without her iconic gingham dress? You almost wouldn't recognize them. Hi, I'm Bobby. I'm Green. This is Culture Kitsch, and today we're taking a deep dive into the costume design history of 1939's The Wizard of Oz, 1978's The Wiz, and 2024's Wicked. Full disclaimer, there will be spoilers for Wicked Part 1, so if you are interested in watching this video but have not seen Wicked and don't want it spoiled, you can stop at this timestamp and then go and see the movie and then come back and watch the full video. Like every good story, we must begin at the beginning. The costume design journey of The Wizard of Oz begins with the book by L. Frank Baum entitled The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, with illustrations by W. W. Dinslow. It is Dinslow's illustrations that give us a visual roadmap for what these characters could look like in a visual medium like film. In the book, we see that Dorothy is a brown-haired girl who wears a red dress before she makes it to Oz. It is in Munchkin Land that she is given silver shoes by the Munchkins from the slain Wicked Witch of the East, and she changes into a blue and white checkered dress on her way to the Emerald City. It's also in this book that we're given illustrations of the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion, and Glinda. Wizard of Oz actually had two film adaptations before the 1939 version, one in 1910 and one in 1925. Now, costuming design-wise, these films are relatively straightforward, calling upon the book to give much of the visual description of the characters, of course. Though there were some interesting designs done for certain characters, but it would be 1939's version that made history. Costuming is an art requiring a keen eye for shapes, patterns, colors, and silhouettes that both satisfy the story on the page while also telling its own story visually. However, for The Wizard of Oz's costume designer, who is simply known as Adrian, costuming was both an art and a science. To lock us down on what's happening in film history at this point, the advent of Technicolor is ramping up in popularity. Now, Technicolor is a film coloring process that was known for producing vibrant, rich, delicious colors. When you think of early Hollywood movie musicals, you think of Technicolor. Though the process was first introduced in the 1910s, the first film to use the Technicolor 3-color film process was 1935's Becky Sharp. But it was films like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from Disney and The Wizard of Oz from MGM that pushed the bounds of where color, a pretty new addition at the time, could go. The costuming journey for The Wizard of Oz begins with figuring out how this massive production was going to take on costumes in a completely new way, while also juggling all of the other problems that this production was experiencing. So let's start with the trio that Dorothy meets in Oz: the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion, and the Tin Man. The trio of the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, and the Cowardly Lion in the film are pretty close to their book counterparts, though there were some creative liberties taken. With the Scarecrow, an earlier iteration of the character from an August 1938 costume test featured a lot more protruding straw and very minimal makeup to Ray Bolger's face. The next month, they destuffed his costume and had minor straw additions to his face, though much of his natural face was very visible. By October, he was seen donning a full mask and hat that would become hallmarks of the Scarecrow character. Some minor changes were made, but the final costume test in November of 1938 is basically what is seen in the final film. The Cowardly Lion was tricky, as you could guess, because the book version of the Cowardly Lion is just a lion. So Adrian essentially had to build an anthropomorphized version of the lion from the ground up. The Cowardly Lion in this film is played by Burt Lahr, and Burt Lahr probably had one of the most uncomfortable costumes. Well, all the costumes were uncomfortable, but amongst the most uncomfortable of the entire cast. The final lion costume was made of real lion pelts, which is, not the most above board. There was an attempt to make a synthetic version of the lion costume, but it just didn't look right. So they went with real lion pelts and manes. Now, the problem that lies with a costume made completely out of lion pelts and manes is that A, it retains heat, and B, it is extremely heavy. Now, add on top of that because of Technicolor, the film set required to have super bright, very hot lights. So needless to say, Bert Lahr was cooking in that Cowardly Lion costume at all times. The heat also caused problems with Ray Bolger's Scarecrow mask too. The mask was made of foam rubber, and when you mix that with very hot lights, it makes for a pretty uncomfortable experience. The intense heat from the light soaked up a lot of the excess oxygen that was in the mask, almost having a shrink wrap effect onto his face, which made it very uncomfortable to breathe. And with how close the mask was affixed to his face, it did leave some imprints on his skin, though it wasn't permanent as some sources would claim. He had imprints on his skin from the Scarecrow mask around 6 months to a year after filming. And now, let's talk about the Tin Man. Originally, the Tin Man was played by Buddy Epson, and his costume was relatively close to the book illustrations, complete with a little metal funnel hat and his little metal bow. And of course, he was all silver. And that presented a bit of a problem. You're seeing a running theme in the production of this film. To make Epson silver, he was covered in clown white base makeup and then dusted with aluminum powder. He had the intended color silver that they wanted, but soon Epson grew ill. Due to a dust being used to get him into his Tin Man makeup, Epson accidentally inhaled some of the powder, which caused an allergic reaction within his lungs, rendering him unable to breathe. October of 1938 saw the production thrown into complete disarray after Buddy Epson had to step away from filming due to his illness. Unfortunately, while he was recovering, he was let go by MGM and replaced with Jack Haley, who would play the Tin Man in the final film. Epson would still go on to have a fruitful career after being unceremoniously let go from the film. In fact, in the early 50s, it was his movements as a very skilled dancer that were used as movement models for the technology that would eventually become audio animatronics that we see in pretty much every major Disney theme park. So they worked out. Somewhat. One of the first hair and makeup tests that Judy Garland did for the film was in April of 1938. The first iterations of Dorothy saw her sporting long blonde hair with spiral curls. While the film was shuffling through many directors, Dorothy's look was also shuffling through many directors. And by the time Richard Thorpe had left the production, this is what Dorothy's final look was. Blonde curls and this particular style of the blue and white dress designed by Adrian. Though Dorothy's physical look, like her hair color and hairstyle, would change, what wouldn't change was that the dress would always be blue and white. As you remember, the blue and white checkered dress is a description from the book. However, there is great significance to the colors blue and white for a heroine like Dorothy. Blue and white are important colors in the story of young heroines. Blue is often associated with a multitude of things, most specifically transformation, dreams, strength, loyalty, tranquility, and introspection. It's a color meant to serve as a reveal of the most true form, and this makes sense because it's often worn by characters who are on a quest to find their most true desire or self, and Dorothy was one of the first characters in film to embody this very fact. This is mainly why you see it worn by young, hopeful, idealistic female leads, and it's always a specific shade of blue. Sky blue. According to the executive director of the Pantone Institute, Latrice Eisman, it's something to look forward to see that blue sky. Under the direction of Victor Fleming is when we start to see the Dorothy that we recognize come more and more into focus. This is when we start to see her sporting that dark chestnut hair and more braided styles. But then there was the matter of the dress itself. The many versions of the dress always harken back to the book description of the dress with the blue and white checkered pattern. Some versions featured the main bodice and skirt of the dress in a solid blue with the white puff sleeves. Some versions featured various trims. However, it was this iteration that was decided to be used in the final film. And of course, we cannot talk about the costuming of Dorothy without talking about the iconic ruby red slippers. Now, if you remember the description from the book, you'll remember that the shoes that the Munchkins give to Dorothy after she kills the Wicked Witch of the East were silver, so why are they red in the film? Well, the answer is the reason for a lot of the color choices that were made in the film. Technicolor. Billy Burke's Glinda dress is this beautiful pale pink as opposed to the book-accurate white or silver because white wouldn't really pop on camera, so the Technicolor company requested that they make her dress pink. Even her jeweled star staff was originally all silver gems, which is the one that we saw gifted to Ariana Grande by Drew Barrymore. But the all silver gems didn't really pop on camera, so Adrian decided to add multicolored gemstones to it, which is the one that we see in the final film. And Technicolor is the reason why the slippers are ruby red. There are about 5,000 sequins that had to be adhered to a couple different pairs of shoes that were used during filming. If you're interested in where a lot of these costumes ended up, the Smithsonian Institute has a great video series on YouTube that talks about it, because where these costumes ended up after filming is Hollywood history all on its own, as we can see with the very recent auction of a pair of ruby slippers that happened literally a couple days ago. The Wicked Witch of the West is also green because of Technicolor, because originally in the book, she wasn't any color. In fact, she was intended to look very, very different. The original Wicked Witch of the West cast in the film was named Gail Sondergaard, and this was the original look for the character, serving very see you next Tuesday as the witch. However, she looks very similar to the highly popular evil queen from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, so there was a shift from Sondergaard being this glamorous and sultry version of the witch to her being an ugly witch, because the studio said that witches are ugly. She did test in the ugly witch makeup, but she ultimately decided to leave the production, citing that playing a witch at that point in her career could hurt her for future roles. Enter Margaret Hamilton, who plays the Wicked Witch of the West in the final film. Adrian wanted to make the costumes of the Wicked Witch of the West as physically imposing as possible. Her donning all black sets her apart from the bright and colorful world of Oz, and the proportions in her hat and dress make her look more imposing. It is important to acknowledge that this was a hellacious production, but there was real artistry at play, especially with the costuming. Though he was never awarded an Oscar for his work, Adrian's work on this film and countless other films are Hollywood history, and it set the tone for how many would dress Oz in the decades to come. Hailed as both a brilliant piece of black cinema and also a horror film by me when I was 6 years old watching it for the first time, The Wiz is one of the most famous entrants in the Oz lexicon. Appearing first on Broadway, The Wiz took home many awards in its original run, including the Tony Award for Best Musical, and very soon after, it was turned into a feature film starring Diana Ross, Michael Jackson, Nipsey Russell, Ted Ross, Lena Horne, and Richard Pryor. The Wiz is truly a celebration of 70s black culture and style. Much of the costumes from the stage play and the film are rooted in style that feels both fantastical yet familiar. And it also calls upon a very obvious locational inspiration in New York City. Tony Walton designed the costumes for this film, and he really went the extra mile to make his costumes feel intricate and fantastical while retaining real-world trappings, because this version of Oz feels that exact way. The costumes have a beautiful homemade quality to them in that they feel wholly unique to each person wearing them, almost as if the materials for the costumes were put together and personalized by each actor. For example, the Munchkins in this version are teens, donning ornate outfits that feature spray paint and graffiti designs, who are led by the Good Witch of the North, known as Miss One, who is wearing a mix of blues, purples, whites, and silvers, drawing closer to the book's version of Glinda, who wears silver and white. Every character's costume feels like a byproduct of the environment that they come from, like the Scarecrow donning a peanut butter cup wrapper for a nose, and the Tin Man being made of materials from the abandoned amusement park where Dorothy and the Scarecrow find him. Diana Ross's Dorothy is meant to be a little bit older than Judy Garland's Dorothy, and we can see that maturity played across in how she's dressed. Ross does not don the classic blue and white pinafore dress that we see in the 1939 version, instead wearing a much more contemporary 70s blouse and skirt with the silver shoes given to her by Miss One. One of the most intricate costumes in the film, and probably in film history, is that of the Wicked Witch of the West, aka Eveline, played by Mabel King. Similarly to Adrian's design approach with the 1939 Wicked Witch of the West, Tony Walton's design for Eveline's costume conveys physical imposition. Her giant dress billows out and is covered from head to toe in ornate gems and bobs and just is completely unavoidable. You cannot miss her. You will not ignore her. The costuming of Eveline is excess to the nth degree. It's a very fun, albeit a little bit terrifying take on the Wicked Witch of the West. We don't really see Lena Horne's Glinda until towards the end of the film, where she is wearing a glittering ensemble of blue and white with a star crown. Like the North Star, she's the one who guides Dorothy home. This film contained so many huge set pieces and musical numbers that involved hundreds of dancers and extras. So Tony Walton had to enlist the help of the film's screenwriter, who also had a fashion design background. And would you believe the film's screenwriter was none other than Joel Schumacher, who is the director of the most visually interesting and far too maligned Batman films, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. While the costumes of the Wiz look very different from the 1939 version, they still carry through the tradition of vivacious and vibrant colors while calling on contemporary styles and silhouettes that feel like a fantastical snapshot of history. The Broadway show and movie based off the book Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West by Gregory Maguire have taken the world by storm for over 20 years now. The film, starring Cynthia Erivo as Elphaba and Ariana Grande Butera, that's what she's credited as, so that's what I'm calling her, as Glinda, or the witch formerly known as Galinda, follows the story of how the witch became wicked. Costume designer Paul Tazewell turned in a beautiful, intricate portfolio of costumes that match perfectly with John M. Chu's interpretation of Oz. But before we can get started on the film, we must start with the show. It is costume designer Susan Hilferty that provided the Tony Award-winning costume design for Wicked on Broadway, and much of the relationship and dynamic between Elphaba and Glinda is in their costumes. Elphaba is very grounded and humble in the beginning and does not want to draw attention to herself, which is why we see her dressed in a frock with her hair in a braid. But that doesn't mean that she's without vibrance to her. Her defying gravity dress from afar seems to be a pretty simple black dress, but up close you'd see that it's layered with over 40 yards of colorful fabric. It's exactly like Elphaba. From afar, people seem to understand her as one thing, but when someone like Glinda made an investment in getting close to her and understanding her, her true colors were revealed. Glinda is the fashionista of Oz. The first dress we see her in the show is patterned after the famed Dior Junon dress. Many of Glinda's dresses feature layers, which could speak to the layers contained within Glinda. She's got more complexity than people give her credit for. Like the Junon dress, many of Glinda's other costumes in the show take after the 1950s Dior aesthetic, like her dress in Thank Goodness. Paul Tazewell also took inspiration from the 1950s Dior aesthetic for the film's version of Glinda. In the show, we also see Glinda in a much more expanded palette of colors, just beyond the traditional pink dress. And this is probably due in very large part to the fact that there was some legal red tape from MGM on what they could use visually in the show. But the expanded palette of greens, blues, and yellows just kind of work for Glinda. Though there are small homages made to the 1939 Adrian designs for the characters, Wicked on Broadway's costume design uses clothes to further fill out characters that we only really get glimpses of in The Wizard of Oz. Which now brings us to Wicked 2024. Paul Tazewell had much in the way of inspiration for how he would choose to dress the Ozians in the film, including the original L. Frank Baum book, the 1939 film, and the novel Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West. It is worth it to note that the movie is not going to be a carbon copy of the show, and so the costumes weren't going to be carbon copies, though we could potentially see a callback or tribute to the show's costuming in Wicked Part 2. But the costume design of the film should be treated as its own thing. So let's begin again with Glinda Upland of the Upper Uplands. We first see her in this gorgeous pink dress that she wears as she descends into Munchkin Land to notify everyone that the Wicked Witch of the West is dead. The gown is a callback and tribute to the pale pink gown worn by Billy Burke in the 1939 film. It is adorned with foils and sequins and carries through one of the most important motifs in Glinda's costuming: the bubble. Tazewell uses the bubble motif to kind of foreshadow what is to come for Glinda. You can see bubbles in her dress that she wears in the Dancing Through Life sequence, and also in the robe that she wears in the Popular sequence. In fact, there are other characters who wear a little mark of their future on their sleeve, like Fiyero, who has wheat embroidered onto his shirt, which definitely foreshadows Elphaba accidentally turning him into the Scarecrow. And Nessa Rose is seen wearing silver shoes with a type of twister design on them, which obviously foreshadows what happens to her at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, because she turns into the Wicked Witch of the East, the house down boots. The second outfit that we see from Glinda is her fantabulous twist on the Shiz University uniform with this lilac and pink striped blazer and skirt. During What Is This Feeling, when Glinda takes off the blazer, her blouse and skirt feel very reminiscent of Diana Ross's Dorothy costume. This uniform shows that she stands out as much as Elphaba, but only one of them is looked down upon for it. The Shiz uniform is a very standard array of blues and golds, but Glinda decided that that role just didn't apply to her, and everyone else was just okay with it. Glinda may hold up the status quo, but that doesn't mean that she abides by it. Rule breaking and going against the grain works for her because she still holds up the status quo in other ways, like socially. The rest of her costumes on the film doubled down on pink, but there's also an interesting structure yet flounce to a lot of her costuming. Whereas her blazers and overcoats would have a very structured neck, a lot of the bottom parts of her ensembles would have a lot of flounce and frill to them, showing that she was willing to be a part of the structure and control of Oz, but still retain a sense of individuality and self. Her enemy to friend to lover, let's be real, Elphaba also contains many multitudes. Elphaba's costume design is rooted, pun intended, in nature. For her, Tazewell wanted to call upon organic elements from nature like mushrooms and fungus. These organic elements also play into her care and activism for the animals. When she shows up to Shiz, she is seen in this beautiful overcoat and dress combination that basically covers her from neck to toe. She's covered almost fully, trying to hide as much of her green skin as possible. You could assume that she was probably instructed to dress this way in an effort to hide her greenness for the comfort of everyone but to the discomfort of her. Whereas Glinda projects her personality through color, Elphaba projects her personality through texture. Much of her costuming contains a lot of 3D elements. Very similar to the show, once you get close to her, you see the gorgeous texture and intricacies of her. When she becomes a student at Shiz, she, like everyone else, does wear the Shiz uniform. But like Glinda, she does still stand out in her uniform, though not in color, but in shape and silhouette. Her Shiz uniform features a very pronounced waist and exaggerated pointed shoulders that definitely pay homage to Margaret Hamilton's Wicked Witch. She may not feel like that girl all the time, but she certainly is that girl in this uniform. It's one of my favorite costumes in the film. One of the most captivating visual traits of Elphaba outside of her green skin is her hair. Her micro braids, to be more specific. The choice to have Elphaba wear micro braids is a key part of drawing a real-world connection between how someone like her is treated in Oz and how Black women are treated in the real world. Cynthia Erivo did not want to divorce her identity as a Black woman from this role, and Elphaba having this hairstyle means that the audience can't either. Elphaba's greenness and Cynthia's blackness are two sides of the same coin. The micro turned to macro aggressions that Elphaba experience plays a very key role in the narrative and politics of Oz. How she is seen and talked about as the other is not just a work of fiction, but is reality and plays directly to the rising fascism that's happening in the land of Oz at the hands of the wizard. So if you think the politics of the film start and stop with the animals, it actually starts with Elphaba. Elphaba conveys her transformation throughout the film in two very key ways: her hair and her shoes. The tight braid that Elphaba wears at the beginning of the film symbolizes her reservations with this new environment and the people that she's meeting. But as her journey unfolds, she quite literally begins to let her hair down. With her shoes, she begins with very grounded, flat boots. But as the story evolves and she comes more into her own, the heels on her shoes gets higher and higher, thus leading us to the crescendo that is defying gravity. So her shoes were setting up her beginning to fly from the onset. While Elphaba and Glinda are at odds at the beginning, the philosophy behind their wardrobes does foreshadow their eventual connection, and we can see that most prominently with this scene in the Oz Dust Ballroom. In this scene, Elphaba wears the hat that Glinda gave her, albeit in bad faith, and Glinda is in this pink and yellow floral-inspired dress. This dress was inspired by roses that Tazewell saw in Regent's Park in London. It's fitting in the scene where Glinda really begins to embrace Elphaba that she is wearing a dress that calls upon organic elements that are found in a lot of Elphaba's costume design. And Elphaba is wearing a hat that will become a hallmark of her identity that was gifted to her by Glinda. Like in the show, Elphaba is the earth and Glinda is the sky. But in that scene, they've met in the middle to find each other. Elphaba and Glinda have very clear differences, but they're in complementary opposition to each other, like I said earlier. Pink goes good with green. Many have taken on the challenge of dressing the fantastical land of Oz, and every iteration has felt similar but different. a symphony of greens and golds, reds and blues, and blacks and pinks. From Adrian to Tony Walton to Susan Hilferty to Paul Tazwell, with the aid of thousands of artists, the wardrobe of Oz fills in and out of this world, and that is what has helped to establish it as one of the most memorable worlds in film history. What's the over-under on this paint coming off?